Hi, everyone. Um, Welcome to this exciting meeting being hosted by the Africa Policy Research Institute. Really excited to be having this conversation around AI in Africa, key concerns and considerations. This really has been a topic that has been growing over the last couple of years, although we know the continent still has issues around the digital divide, with only about 30% of people having access to the internet. But when it comes to our data and new technologies that are actually existent, it means we need to start having the conversation around AI and the things that we need to take into account so that we do not see harms perpetuated that we've seen before with digital technologies being rolled out, such as mobile phones and the internet, but also consider having the policies in place that allow for the African region to actually have benefits from the AI systems being rolled out. So today I am pretty excited to have an exciting set of panelists being joining us for a conversation. So I'll introduce the panelists and then I'll hand it over to Dr. Rachel Adams, who will present the work that's been done. So to start off with, we have Rebecca Yekatimbo. Rebecca is a techie writer and researcher. She's currently a community engagement fellow at Mozilla, my colleague as well, working towards building an open voice dataset in Kiswahili to promote voice technology. She's actually working on establishing and supporting diverse Kiswahili language and tech communities along the axis of gender, age, regional origin, accent, and vernacular usage towards building an open voice dataset in Kiswahili. So welcome, Rebecca, to the panel. Secondly, we have Dr. Adekemi Omotuora. She is a lecturer at the Faculty of Law, University of Lagos, and currently a Norbert Elias Research Fellow at the ZIF Center for Interdisciplinary Research, University of Bielefeld, Germany. At this institute, she's working with the International Research Group on the economic and legal challenges in the advent of smart products. And welcome to the panel as well, Adekemi. And then lastly, we have Dr. Rachel Adams. Rachel is the principal researcher at Research ICT Africa, where she will direct the AI4D Africa Just AI Center. Rachel has published widely in areas such as AI and society, gender, and AI transparency, open data, and data protection. So welcome to all the panelists, and I'm really excited to hear your insights. And before I hand over to Rachel, I forgot to introduce myself, which is the most pertinent thing. So my name is Chennai, and I'm a special advisor at Africa Muradi Mozilla Foundation, where I manage the Common Voice African Languages Fellows, who focused on building the Kiswahili dataset and also support movement building on the continent as part of Mozilla's work towards trustworthy AI. And on that note, I will actually hand over to Rachel to present to us her findings and the work that she's done on this topic.
Thank you so much, Shanae, and it's a real pleasure to be here with such excellent speakers, both Rebecca and Kemi and Shanae. I've had the pleasure of being in discussion with before, so it's lovely to be with you all again. And thanks ever so much to Olumide Abimbola for putting together not just the African Policy Research Institute, now based in Berlin, but also these important thematics, of which digital policies and artificial intelligence is one that has really significant policy implications and social ramifications, not just for the continent, but for the world. And we need to be thinking collectively about the ways in which we address some of the harms that we see arising and some of the inequalities that we see being perpetuated by artificial intelligence. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen and I'm going to be talking to you for about 20 minutes before we open up for a broader panel discussion. This is work in progress. What I'm trying to do here is build a critique and an understanding around the role that the African continent is already playing within the global system and ecosystems of artificial intelligence, to think through some of the emerging policy areas that we are seeing and policy considerations that we are seeing globally, and their relevance to the African region, and some of the newly developed policy responses coming out of various different African countries. And lastly, to think through what are the kind of key policy considerations that we need to be taking into account in order to address some of the harms that we are seeing, but in order to ensure that artificial intelligence doesn't worsen inequality, and that it is put to work to advance inclusive developmental agendas, which is very easy to say and very difficult to do. So that, I think I've given a little bit of an overview anyway of what I'm going to be speaking about today, but I'm just structuring it along these three questions, along these three parts, around the role of the continent already, the issues we see arising, and therefore the kind of issues that may and do need policy responses, the emerging policy landscape globally and within the region, and then the key considerations for African policymakers as we look to develop AI solutions and AI strategies that support developmental needs within the region. So I'm going to just start by giving a little bit of a background around the kind of global landscape of artificial intelligence. Of course, it's this massively cited, highly praised technology that is thought to bring about benefit for humanity writ large through efficiencies and smart cars and smart speakers and smartphones and all these kind of various analytics that is supposed to make our lives easier and inform policymakers by providing them with kind of really accurate critical insights into the kind of social dynamics within their countries and the kinds of things that they may need to respond to. But AI is first and foremost an industry. It is a commercial product that, or a commercially designed technology that's being used to advance capitalist and economic gain across the world in ways that does not necessarily provide well-distributed benefits. So you can see from this was a report that PricewaterhouseCoopers came out with in 2017 that was really, everyone got very excited about this report, and it was called Sizing the Prize, and it gave this kind of ballpark figure of the amount of money, I think it was $15.9 trillion that would be gained to the global economy through artificial intelligence. And then they broke down, well, where does this 15 trillion get divided? Who's gonna gain from this? And it's mostly China and North America, which we can imagine, given that they are the biggest producers of these technologies, with big tech companies like Amazon and Facebook and Alibaba and so forth in China. But what I found so critical was partly the kind of illustration of this map that put Africa together with Oceania and other Asian markets down there in Australia. So there wasn't even a kind of figure put to how Africa might gain monetarily, economically from artificial intelligence, but it was also lumped together with this other region. So it was really hard to see, well, what benefit would the region gain from this technology that's being lauded by development banks and policymakers and just about anyone as being able to solve all the world's problems, including Africa's developmental problems. And it was a really kind of critical starting point for me. So what I'm going to do over the next couple of slides is just illustrate a couple of areas where we see artificial intelligence having an impact within African societies in ways that we need to take note of. And I am going to emphasize the negative and detrimental examples because this isn't as spoken about as the positive examples. There are many positive examples. There are many communities across the region, and I'm sure Rebecca can speak a little bit more to the really exciting and nuanced work that's happening in different parts of the region to advance locally built and local ecosystems around artificial intelligence. But what I want to focus on here is the negative impacts that we're seeing that are going to require particular policy solutions and responses. And I'm picking out 3 from what is really quite a long list. So facial recognition is perhaps one of the most obvious and well cited and now quite well known AI-driven technology that has been evidenced to show quite serious harms, to the extent where Facebook or Meta has now banned or has put a moratorium on the use of facial recognition on their platform, and that's a whole other issue to debate. But across the African continent, increasingly, we are seeing facial recognition technologies being installed in cities as a means of, as a crime prevention measure, to predict and assess where crime may happen, and then to protect really what is the elites within these cities where these cameras are being installed, from what is very stereotyped ideas about who the types of criminals might be. So facial recognition systems are a biometric-based AI technology that reads facial signatures and compares them against a broad database in order to make predictions about whether a particular face is associated with particular behavior that might be problematic or criminal or so forth. So it's based on a whole load of socially problematic assumptions that are deeply racialized and gendered. And I've got here the example of Vumacam in South Africa, because South Africa is a country with a very recent racial past that has not been overcome at all. And these kinds of contexts need to be taken into account in very serious ways when adopting technologies that have already been shown to be highly inaccurate and deepen and exacerbate racial and gendered biases. South Africa and Johannesburg is certainly not the only place. We've seen the rollout of facial recognition technologies also in Uganda, in Kampala, and across the region. They tend to be offered by foreign companies, not necessarily developed locally. So this is also something that we need to bear in mind. Where is the technology coming from? What data is it being trained on, so that we can kind of understand the level of accuracy when being applied and installed within a different context other than that from out of which it was developed. And then what are the kind of social factors that we need to take into account that may be different where the technology was developed and that can exacerbate harms and inequalities. The next one I want to talk about is the social and environmental impact of big tech, which is, I think, something we fail to see so readily. There's a lot of talk about how artificial intelligence can provide us with the kind of intelligence and analytics we need to really understand the impact of climate change, to develop the kind of statistical instruments and modeling we need to track climate change and therefore put in place the kinds of policies we might need to address it. But AI itself is environmentally really problematic and damaging to produce and to store and keep. So you can see there's this graph from Forbes that's now really kind of well cited about the CO2 emission levels of training an AI system. But on top of that, AI systems require massive amounts of data that tend to be stored on the cloud, but the cloud is not a cloud, it is physical infrastructure. So that data has to be stored somewhere and requires land to store it somewhere, and it requires massive amounts of water and also power and electricity that's not stable in many regions, in many parts of the region, in order to maintain. Connected to this is a story that came out of Cape Town fairly recently, where Amazon Web Services was seeking to create this massive data warehouse and also kind of headquarters for AWS on what was thought to be and considered to be an indigenous land. And it's an indigenous group in South Africa that has limited rights anyway within the kind of political system. But what I think this example shows us, and they're taking Amazon Web Services to court, we're yet to hear the outcome of this, but what I think it shows us is the really difficult competing demands when you have a foreign tech company that's coming in and that's offering something like 30,000 jobs. And then on the other hand, you have to balance the potential environmental and social and cultural impact of where these kind of structures and the kind of real estate, I suppose, that AWS will require will be installed. So I think these are some of the really difficult policy choices and decisions that policymakers will be facing increasingly when thinking about how to bring in foreign direct investment and foreign technologies and the impacts that it may have on societies that are both positive in terms of job creation and negative in terms of environmental, social, cultural impact. The last one I want to talk a little bit about is clickwork and gig economies. So gig economies are becoming increasingly more common across the continent, not just from your kind of Ubers and your Airbnbs and the foreign-owned platform economies, but also from locally developed ones like Bolt Food app, and there's many good examples of local gig economies in Kenya, Tanzania, and Ethiopia in the report from Mercy Corps that I have put here on the screen. But there are increasing problems for workers who are involved in these economies in terms of lack of labor protection rights, holiday leave, social security, sickness pay, access to healthcare. This is increased, so it's a very kind of informal, unstructured, unprotected form of work that tends to disadvantage women more, who have less control over their daily lives and the time in which they could perhaps spend as being a kind of gig economy worker, or the areas in which they can travel and so forth. So better labor rights is needed here, better regulation is needed to protect workers, and also to protect against the kind of monopolies that are still occurring because of the foreign platform economies that are coming in. On the other hand, and I think one of the big things we're always talking about is the potential for job loss from automation and AI-driven automation on the continent. And that's certainly a very, very real issue. I've not put it here because I wanted to just find a couple of examples that may be less often spoken about to talk about here. But another one is the clickwork that is being outsourced to places where labor is cheaper or bordering on free. So this is a wonderful article from Phil Jones, who I believe is writing a book on this topic, who talks about the refugee camp in Kenya, Dadaab, where there are these massive tents filled with hundreds and hundreds of computers, and refugees are being required to sit at these computers for many hours a day and label and annotate the data that then comes to be used within artificial intelligence systems. And data labeling and annotation is a kind of key step along the way that's not performed by a machine. It's performed by human labor, and it's the part of the unseen human labor that goes into creating AI systems. But it's often deeply sensitive and traumatizing images that need to be labeled, such as child pornography or terrorist related content online that needs to be taken down, things that are really distressing for people that are already vulnerable, to then be paid next to nothing, if anything, to be reviewing and labeling sort of thousands of images per day, again in this kind of unstructured, informal way that mimics a pattern of outsourcing cheap labor to the global south. So AI continues that in new ways that are not as visible or not as seen as we're used to. So there's a real need to draw attention to some of these issues. I'm trying to be mindful of time, and there's absolutely loads that we can talk about. So I'm going to move to look at some of the policy responses that are emerging globally around artificial intelligence, the extent to which they're relevant within the African context, and the kind of policy responses that we are beginning to see on artificial intelligence from a couple of African countries. So I've sort of put together this overview of some of the kind of key policy areas that are coming out in national AI strategies around the world. This is adapted from a Medium post. I can't remember the person who wrote it, but the link is there. And then the Rwandan AI strategy, which I'm going to go into in a tiny bit more detail. So the Rwandan strategy follows this kind of 3 layers of structuring an AI policy, the foundational enablers. So here I've listed AI research, promoting research in AI, so that there's a stronger research base from which, or local research base from which to develop AI solutions, whether in industry or in government. Developing talent in artificial intelligence and retention of AI, computer scientists, machine learning specialists, deep learning specialists, and so forth. The digital and data infrastructure. This is something that, as we will see, is particularly important in the African context when, as Shanae spoke about at the beginning, there is real divides and inequalities in terms of who has access. It's not just that 30% of people on the African continent have access to the internet, it's who are those 30%? And they're mainly men, and they're mainly people from a higher economic bracket and people in the urban areas. So there's a huge amount of people that are really left out of the possibilities and the opportunities that AI and the digital economies bring. Together and tied to this is data infrastructure, which again I'll speak about in a bit more detail, and then skills development more broadly for the society to create a more digitally focused labor market. So for those people that whose jobs may be replaced by automation, the kind of quick policy response is, we're going to upskill and reskill them. So this is why this is this kind of big policy area. And then the accelerators, because these AI policies and strategies tend to have a major objective to advance artificial intelligence and the economic benefits it supposedly brings within a nation. That's the overall rationale for pretty much any AI policy. So the accelerators are to adopt AI within industry and adopt AI within the public sector. And then is this kind of last bit, and for those of us that come from law and human rights and ethics, we hate to see this at the end. It's integrated throughout. There is ethics and the ethical principles needed to guide the development of AI technologies and the policies and the infrastructure to support them, and the regulation and governance such as laws and standards, audits, assessment frameworks, and so forth needed to protect against the kinds of harms that AI may produce, and we don't know the full scope of what those harms are. So this is an example from Rwanda. This is Rwanda's national AI policy that's still being validated. So it's not online, it's not publicly available at the moment because it hasn't yet been formally adopted. But we can see here an outline of the 6 policy areas, and you can see how it follows that enablers, accelerators, and safeguards function. I am particularly interested in the enablers because the enablers are a particularly important place for addressing some of that foreign tech power that I explained and tried to show a little bit in the earlier half of this presentation, and building, and the response to that is not just the mechanisms, and I'll speak about this, needed to ensure beneficial foreign direct investment, but to build local capacity and ecosystems around artificial intelligence, so that hopefully locally relevant AI is built, and an AI which supports much more directly the local economy. So Rwanda has here 21st century skills and high AI literacy, which I think is deeply important. We need to facilitate a much broader participation base of people who are involved in decisions and thinking and discourse and debate and discussion around artificial intelligence, which means supporting literacy across the continent in all different levels of society around what is AI, what is its impacts, what are your rights in relation to digital systems. Reliable infrastructure and computing capacity. So that's some of those questions around access to networks, access to the kind of power and electricity which is significant, required to power and produce an AI system, and then a robust data strategy. AI requires data, requires almost endless amounts of data. So then there's questions about, well, who has access to that data? How accurate is that data? How representative of society is that data? So there's many questions around data governance, data access, data quality, data systems, data rights, data protection, that is a kind of core part of an AI policy. Egypt's national AI strategy, which came out earlier this year, I think is really, really interesting. And I urge anybody who is interested in African responses to AI to have a look at the Egyptian national AI strategy. So again, they've got these kind of 4 pillars and 4 enablers. So the 4 pillars mimic that kind of accelerator level, and you see the use of AI in government. What I think is really good about the Egyptian national AI strategy is, instead of saying we're going to adopt AI widely within industry, they say we want to adopt AI for development. We want to adopt AI that supports our developmental priorities. And they have broken this down into agriculture, environment, water management, healthcare, Arabic natural language processing, which I think is really important. And I'm sure Rebecca can speak to us much more about why it's important to ensure that we have NLP systems that are outside of the dominant language frames, although Arabic is the dominant language, economic planning and development, and manufacturing and smart infrastructure management. They also place an emphasis on capacity building. And the other thing that I think is valuable about what the Egyptian national AI strategy is putting forward is this emphasis on international cooperation and working with other African governments, and they've spoken too about the Arab positions, given their kind of MENA position globally, in developing good governance and standards and thinking and responses around AI. So this is another area that I think we're not quite emphasizing enough, and is particularly important to think about the role of regional cooperation as we develop AI policy responses. You can see on the right here that there are 4 pillars that support the the four enablers that support the four pillars. So that kind of baseline level is governance, data, ecosystem, which we hope includes much more broadly the communities that are affected by artificial intelligence, and then infrastructure too. So I'm going to, sorry, this is not letting me skip a slide. Let's have a look. Here we go. I've skipped over one slide, so let me go back to that. This is just to think about some of the areas of relevance and not relevance, irrelevance for the African continent. And when we speak of the African continent, it is not a conceptual whole. There's many different needs and societal needs and societal dynamics. So even just to speak about the African region as a kind of conceptual whole is in itself problematic. So I do just want to highlight that. But this is the EU approach and the extent to which the two regulatory instruments, the GDPR and the AI Act that's being proposed, have relevance for African policymakers as they deliberate and consider their own responses to artificial intelligence. The GDPR is, of course, the General Data Protection Regulation, and across many African countries, we already see data protection laws and standards, some of which preceded the GDPR. What I think is an area of similarity is this focus on human rights and fundamental rights as the kind of basis from which to develop regulatory responses. Within an African context, this idea of human rights is much broader. It's not just limited to an individualistic framing where privacy is the kind of top trump card. I think in an African context, there's ideas around when privacy may conflict with other rights, and we can think of this, or other values, and there's a kind of deeper nuance there. There's also ideas around community rights and ideas around freedom ethics, such as in Article 19 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the right to be free from domination from another group, which I think is particularly important when we're thinking about the foreign influences on the continent that AI is very much a part of. The EU is also similar in some ways to the African region insofar as this is not that top producer of technology as we saw in the beginning with China and the US. The EU is slightly behind and sees itself as winning the arms race with respect to AI in terms of its regulatory and ethical frameworks. That's another point for discussion. But I think, some of the problematics of what the EU has proposed with this risk-based approach outlined in the AI Act is it doesn't necessarily help us to get to the fundamentals around the structural impacts of artificial intelligence, the infrastructural needs that are required to really support local AI ecosystems and technologies. And I've listed some of those longer structural term impacts there at the bottom. I'm aware that we're running out of time, so this is my last kind of slides on recommendations, many of which I think I've spoken about. So I just want to highlight the kind of gendered dimensions that I don't think I have spoken about enough, and which Shania and Rebecca and Kemi are all doing leading work on, and I'm sure we can pick up on this point at a later stage. But just to say, in terms of advancing African AI ecosystems and local AI solutions, and this emphasis on data and digital infrastructure, we really need to be thinking about who has access and how do we support women to have access to data and digital services and opportunities in particular. Similarly, who is developing and designing these AI technologies? There's a table here on the right-hand side of the screen, which shows the number of women, the percentage of women, if you look at the bottom couple of lines there, that are graduates in STEM. So in the African region, it's 33%, which is less, apart from Oceania. and the number of percentage of women who are engineering technology researchers is only 6%. This is incredibly low. Who is then designing the technology? If it is locally developed here, who is designing and reviewing it and part of the decision-making process? And the number of percentage of women in telecoms industry. So it's really, really low. So part of our policy responses therefore need to be, how do we promote programs or roll out programs to support career pathways for women in STEM and related AI fields, including the kind of labor rights needed to ensure that workplaces are culturally supportive of women being leaders in this space. I've already spoken about the need for literacy and building skills development policies that take into account the lived experiences of people who may not want to be upskilled or may not have time to be upskilled, and we need to be thinking in much more nuanced ways around what that looks like. And then just lastly, these are a couple of mechanisms that I have listed in terms of how we can better support beneficial foreign direct investment and counteract some of that foreign influence of power that we are seeing in the region. So some of this is through regional agreements to support fair trade deals and collaboration and data sharing to support local AI innovations. Local officials that receive technologies from elsewhere need to have the capacity to understand how it works, to review and audit it, conduct impact assessments, and so forth. Institutions need to be equipped to hold foreign companies to account for any harms caused, and then labour standards and protections for gig workers and the digital economy. And really, this is just a kind of initial list. There's many more things I think we need to be considering. But I'm going to end it here. I know I've gone woefully over time. I'm very sorry, but looking forward to the comments and responses from you, Rebecca, and Kemi and Shania. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. As always, when there is, a large amount of information and a new area of work, we do tend to go over time. But it was really interesting just following through, that process of thinking of the problematic areas that are really highlighted and the way in which policy interventions have been developed, and thinking about recommendations that are actually going to take into account more so issues around context, more so located in understanding of existing digital inequalities, and also really trying to recognize that we do need the foreign investment, but how do we do it in a way that benefits everyone? So I'm going to take it back to the panelists to hear their responses and reflections. And I will start off with Adekemi.
Okay, thank you very much, Inai. Thanks, Rachel, for that very because I read the policy as well, the draft. So it's very interesting, and I think a lot of hard work went into it. So well done. I quite agree with you on all the areas that you have highlighted, the socio-economic issues, infrastructure, human rights, all the implications that this have for Africa, the economic impact, small businesses, labor, monopolies, and all these areas. But there are two things that I just, I don't know if this is something that policy should actually address, but I'm thinking about it, particularly in the light of the work that I'm presently doing, right? So I think that when we work in this area, sometimes we overlook, I think two things that I think we overlook. The first one is, should certain kinds of AI be prohibited? In terms of solving some of the problems that we're now identifying. And I say that because I think you mentioned the AI, the EU AI regulation, the draft regulation as well. And when I looked at it, I saw, a list, this raft of prohibited AI, I would say in terms of those prohibitions, the horse already bolted. Those solutions, those AI, they already exist in the market. So my thoughts are, is it possible? And I know this can be, like a moral, ethical issue, kind of, not strictly legal and policy. But I'm thinking, is it possible? Should we be thinking, actually, should certain kinds of AI, should Africa be thinking about that, so that we don't get to the problems and then start thinking, what's the solution here? I mean, you've talked about facial recognition. I think it was only last month that the European Parliament said, we are banning the use of facial recognition. There was a resolution, I think, that was passed banning the use of facial recognition, I think, in public places. So should we get to that point when the harm is already done before we think of, because we are talking of beneficial AI, not all AI. We realize that these things can be built. There is the capacity to build these kinds of systems, but the fact that we can do them, does that mean that we should have them or we should use them? So I think that's one aspect that I want to look at. And of course, I think earlier this year, the UK announced, everyone was excited about autonomous vehicles. They thought, we finally have AVs on the road. But it wasn't about AVs. It was something called automated lane keeping technology, where the driver should be ready to take over, the so-called driverless car at every point in time. But of course, already there are full AVs available in the market. So, you get to a point when already the technology has matured before you now start saying, no, we can't have that. Yes, we can have that. But even at that point, when you say you can't have it, it's already available, is in the market. If you prohibit it for certain purposes, well, those who want to use it for malicious purposes will use it anyways. So I think that's the first thing that, occurred to me about how we develop policies in this area and how they should evolve. And the second one, which, is based on the work that, I'm now doing here, is the social problem of acceptance that we are not thinking about, I think, often, enough. We think this is good technology. Of course, everyone will like it. You can have better access to health. But are we thinking of the problem of maybe social resistance, lack of clarity about the liability regime, about how people are able to, so if there's a problem, if there's harm, what's the remedy? So these are all issues, social trust issues, familiarity, So if all these are issues that are unresolved, you can have all the good AI that you want and advertise it as AI for good, and there'll still be resistance, from the community about using it. And one example that came to my mind, just briefly, I work with these young people, and there was a time we're discussing, is humanoid, like the embodied AI. And there was one that, we had to watch this short video about a nurse, I think, or was a doctor, AI doctor. And all these guys who are like 19, 24 were going, like, I would never allow that kind of doctor to touch me. I would be suspicious if it was dispensing, if it was at the pharmacy dispensing and these are, Gen Z. So when you talk of older people, then what are we likely to face in terms of acceptance, even if this technology is good? So these are the two issues, I think, when it comes to like developing policy for Africa, which, I'm just thinking about whether it's something that we need to be thinking along with all these problems that we are seeing, because I think these problems are front-loaded problems, but these other ones are rather intrinsic, and maybe we need to be thinking about them as well. So that was a long speech, sorry.
Absolutely. I think, thank you so much, Adekemi. I think those points are so important, and as you rightly say, often overlooked when we think about AI within the policy conversation. They do emerge sometimes in like civil society and digital rights conversations, but that link in terms of bringing them into policy is so important. And I've really captured the thinking around, do we need to have everything built for AI? So think about that prohibition list, especially in the African continent, and also the social acceptance. Are people actually, we've had the case of people actually, striking because of the idea that the machines are taking over their jobs in the banking sector. So what's needed around the social acceptance? And then I'll pass it on to Rebecca before Rachel then responds.
Sure. Thanks, Rachel, for the awesome presentation. There's so many interesting takeaways from it, and some points that I definitely feel that they respond to a lot of the things that I also have been seeing, observing in the space that I work in. So when you look at, when you mentioned the digital infrastructure aspect of it, I think it's very relevant, especially looking at the kind of scope that we face in the continent at the moment, issues around access, affordability, gaps around just the infrastructure itself, how much digital investment is being made across the continent in terms of things as basic as internet access, having access to devices, because we do know AI builds on having infrastructures that are very powered, having internet connection, having high-end devices that can be able to help all these processes happen effectively. So just looking at that scope and thinking about, from a policy perspective, you need to look at the regulation part of it. How do we address issues around access? How do we bridge the gap and ensure that people are connected so that when we are creating AI programs, they actually make meaningful impact and are able to reach people, people can access them. But then we also look at the governance aspect, data governance itself. So we have still challenges across the continent in terms of just legislation, putting out data protection and privacy acts, putting out strategies by governments on how they'll be able to handle AI. I must say that for most of our governments, we really move behind and wait for something to happen for us to create something. But it would be best to stay ahead of the curve and from a policy perspective, start regulating, start creating policies that can help to make sure that the space adheres to the rights of people, but at the same time, just create an environment that is enabling for the startups or the people that are creating technology. But then the aspect of reskilling that you talked about, I think we have a wave of people with skills in AI across the continent being recruited and leaving the continent. So we also need to look at how we can maintain the people who have these skills. How do we maintain them in the continent instead of having them move out and then go up to Silicon Valley and other places where their skills are compensated for? The government is taking care of them. They're getting the right kind of platform to work from. I think that's something that the governments of Africa needs to look at. But then we also look at how we can address the gaps that exist. When you mentioned the statistics on gender and looking at tech and the research sector and just how varied the gender part is, just look at 7% and we think of the other places which have 30 or 50%. We are really having a challenge of building inclusive AI if we do not have varying skills from varying groups. When I talk of that, I mean having people who are representative of different groups, having different gender groups represented as part of the AI process. If they're not part of it, then we're not creating an AI which will be inclusive, an AI that will reach people. So that's also a challenge that we need to think about when, not only when it comes to reskilling, but also thinking on how we can make sure that we have the right skill sets, we have people that are representative, that they're going to represent the perspective of different people when they're building AI that will work for the people. But then also looking at just how we're moving as the continent so far, and some of the things that you have addressed, looking at the examples of the gig economy and how people are being affected by it, how people are thinking of how they can be part of that process. There's also the whole issue about taxing that is ongoing in our continents. How do we look at taxing and the gig economy? Things around We have bloggers in Tanzania who have been charged. They need to get licenses. There are people who have to pay taxes in order to participate and get access to these jobs. So how can we just look back from a policy perspective and say, how can the government create a better environment for people to actually work on AI? But also, how can they create an enabling environment for it to be a safe place for people to actually say, I can invest in AI in Africa. It's going to pick up, people are going to take it. But then Kemi also talked of acceptance, which is very key. If we do not build something for the community, acceptance will also be very low. So part of it is to just make sure they are part of the process from the very beginning. I'll use the phrase from the farm to the table, the whole scope, they should be part of it. If people are part of it, then we're going to be able to build something that they're going to accept. But acceptance beyond goes just participation. It also brings up the aspect around language, the aspect around making sure the context is right for the community that we're building for. So all those aspects being able to be captured will really create the kind of environment that we need for AI to thrive, but also the kind of environment to be able to sort of minimize the negatives that comes with AI. I think those are some of the things that I could pick up from the conversation we had, and I think really make it a meaningful conversation around AI considerations across the continent. Back to you, Chenai.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I think that phrasing that you put in terms of thinking about from the farm to the table, amongst all the other amazing points you raised, is really that context of, at the end of the day, there's going to be limited social acceptance if people are not part of the process or understand what's going on. So we have to think about interventions from a process of actually involving everyone from, throughout the whole ecosystem. And I think, as well as one of the images that Rachel had in terms of thinking about like the value chain, that like global value chain and where Africa is also indicative of how we're not included in the process right from the beginning. And then we only come to, to just be like at the table, but you don't know, like the process that was done at the back. So that I really like how you connected those points to the points that Kimmy had raised. So Rachel, I'll hand it back to you for some responses to some of the points that have been raised.
Thank you so much. This is really very interesting, and I think it just shows the kind of level of complexity of the policy responses and considerations that need to be thought through within our even differing African context. So this is, really exciting, and thank you to you both for such considered remarks and responses. Kemi, I think you raise a number of important points there. There's an important point around timing, what evidence we have in order to make decisions about what technologies are harmful within our society. When do we act on technologies that perhaps we don't have the evidence of quite how harmful they are, but it's clear from other contexts that they are harmful? When do we consider a moratorium until we have the evidence, or just a complete ban like the AI Act has on certain kind of very high risk technologies? And I think that is important, because I think in terms of kind of developmental priorities within African cities, for example, facial recognition technologies are not the most important thing that's needed to support everybody's well-being. I remember speaking to a group of students from Yaoundé in Cameroon who were speaking about the facial recognition technologies that have been set up, but there's rubbish and waste all over the streets that's not picked up. And it shows this kind of critical lack of prioritization in terms of what do we need and how does AI fit within this kind of list of needs in differing contexts. So there is a question, I think, too, about when do we need AI within African context? Do we even need it? As well as then all the questions about, well, what kind of harm might they pose? What kind of risk level? I certainly think that facial recognition technologies are not valuable and should be banned for all the reasons that's been put forward by excellent scholars and thinkers and analysts. It is used regularly in airports. So when we think about that idea of when something is banned, it's never quite total. There are always spaces where these technologies are, there are exceptions and exemptions within law where they continue to exist, much more under the radar. And I think, you know, something we haven't spoken about is the ways in which these technologies are used to monitor and control migrants and asylum seekers, and the impact that has on the right to asylum, and questions of security of person, and a whole load of other deeply problematic and moral questions that's raised with respect to the treatment of asylum seekers and refugees, and the way in which AI is used to exacerbate that, of which facial recognition technology is just one amongst a suite of technologies. So I think we must also just bear in mind, you know, what happens when something is seen to be banned within law, but does still exist in other places that are less seen. And I really like your question about timing and when do we act. And I think Shania had also had a question around that, and what is the priority, what needs to be done later. So perhaps we can you know come back to that point, because I think that's super critical. I certainly don't have all the answers there. And again, Rebecca, you raised any number of really important points, and I certainly didn't make the point around how do you not only put in place mechanisms to prevent harmful foreign technology being adopted within the continent, but how do you create enabling environments to promote the right kinds of technological investments and innovations? And that does come through good policies, but also kind of affirmative and transformative and incentivizing policies. The question of the retention of AI skills on the continent is a massive issue that's not just in the kind of technical space, but also in the kind of regulatory and policy space, and across the board. And I think, you know, that's a really kind of broader, bigger question that does require, you know, some of those points you raised about governments giving such people platforms to kind of feel a real sense of value and worth in what they're doing, and see the importance and in what they're doing, and incentivize that properly. And again, with gig economies, I agree, there's a number of other points around taxation and licensing that also come into play there, and I think I really just kind of touched on the surface. For me, a massive concern is participation and how we involve people. And, you know, certainly for somebody like me that sits at that kind of policy level, it can seem really out of reach and really academic and really theoretical, but that's where so much of the problems lie. And Shania, I like how you match that to the global space, where African policymakers are not part of certainly not sufficiently part of the deliberation and discussions to get to the point of arriving at the formulation of global standards and policies around AI ethics and so forth. But I do think that there's a real question about how do we meaningfully involve the communities that are affected, many of whom may not necessarily know the extent to which they may be affected by AI technologies. And Rebecca, I know you've done far more work here and can speak more to this point, but I do feel that that's a kind of a central question and priority, really, is to really widen the base of who's involved in the conversation. So Shania, I'm going to hand back to you, and thank you both to Kemi and Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Rachel. So we actually have made up for the time and we've got space for some questions. So there are some questions that I would like to pose to the complete panelists, and I would also encourage the panelists to ask each other questions if there's some things that have popped up from what Rachel has said. So I guess I'll actually start with you, Rachel. So I hope you have the energy for this one. But I think as you were doing your work, right, and doing the assessment of the current policies that are actually in place, what are some policy recommendations that you think can be done in a short space of time? And I mean, like policy making time. So we know that's like 2 years a year, and others that require longer term interventions. So some that require more so kind of like a structural change or something that we know, we put the roots in now, we're going to see the fruit like maybe in 10 years.
Yeah, I think this is a brilliant and difficult question. I think the immediate thing is we need to put in place mechanisms to address harms when they occur. So making sure, which requires that people know when harms have occurred, so advocacy programs and public awareness through good media platforms and good kind of sharing of stuff to really, I think the immediate thing is to address the harms. And there's a number of ways in which that's done, including kind of people knowing when a harm has occurred and being able to detect that and follow a course of action, but having mechanisms in place to address that through kind of audits or impact assessments or industry standards or procurement standards for AI solutions, having independent bodies, the judiciary equipped to deal with these difficult questions and difficult problems that don't seem to squarely fall within a particular legal framework like data protection law. How far does it really help in some of these harms that may not necessarily be directly a privacy or data protection violation? And then so I wonder, whether it's some of those kind of more obvious standard settings and increasing understanding around AI and its harms across a kind of much wider group, or all different levels of society really, is a starting point. All policymakers need to be equipped to begin to understand these issues and then come and address them and know that many of the ethical issues and the harms, we're yet to see them, we're not yet to see what the evidence is. Some of it is not speculative, but there's a very good basis on which to know and assume that certain technologies are going to be harmful, but there's not enough evidence to show that always. And then I suppose the longer term structural ones is the continuation of the advancement of digital policies and agendas for providing inclusive rollout of digital and data infrastructure and programs to advance women in technology, women in STEM, women in STEM workplaces, and those kinds of things. It's really hard to prioritize. So I'd be really keen for Rebecca and Kemi's views on this, and yours, Shanae, on this particular question.
Thanks, Rachel. I'll open it up to Rebecca or Kemi if you might also have thoughts, if you think there are some short-term policy responses that we could put in place and some long-term policy responses that we could build up from.
Okay, so can I? Okay, so I think in terms of I can only think of and I think Rebecca touched on it. I think it's something to do with the skills, because I just noted it. The skill set. How do you incentivize those who have these skills? How do you develop the skills so that you can have more localized solutions or products, AI that is relevant to the African context and the African problems and the development. So that's what sort of stood out to me as something that governments can immediately start to address, because that's really a drain on the continent. I remember it's what is often talked about in Nigeria, about how if you would have a pool of talent somewhere, they would suddenly disappear because they've gone off somewhere else where the environment is more conducive. So I would say, you know, I mean, of course, also being a teacher, how do you bring that, you know, into the classroom with the, you know, the students? How do you promote this idea that, look, this is an area that is worth going into? And because they are within the environment, they are in Africa, they know what the problems are, they are better able to understand what the problems are. They can build solutions that are far more relevant. But you see, as soon as they have any opportunity elsewhere, because the environment is poor in terms of incentives and other things, they are off. And then we start from scratch again. So, you know, I think that policy should prioritize skills development and skills retention.
Just to also add on what Kemi said, I think they can also prioritize addressing issues around access as one of the key things that maybe policy could look at. Currently, the movement's going on around just how we can get community networks licensed is quite a key thing. We've seen Kenya move to licensing it, which is already a step in ensuring that we have access, which is a step to ensuring that people can be able to participate meaningfully in AI. But if we also have the same movement happening in other countries across the continent, it really go a long way. And from that perspective, we need to look at policies that can enable these alternative solutions to connectivity. But then we also need to ensure that we have digital investments that are just there to ensure that we have the right infrastructure in place to ensure that AI can actually work and run in our countries, and also just keep working on policies around data, especially data. How do we ensure that data is safe, data protection and privacy? Those are some of the things that can already start being working on while we're moving towards ensuring that we have a framework or a structure in which AI can thrive across the continent.
Absolutely. And I think I like the way that the triangulation of the points that, like, long term, we've got a long way to go, but like immediately thinking about skills and connecting them to, and reskilling and connecting them to already existent issues that we know in terms of the brain drain that we have on the continent. Thinking about like advocacy campaigns, because you can't, you know, when you're advocating against harms, there needs to be a documentation of these are the harms that people are experiencing. And then also just really relating it to access. I always consider this conversation around AI as an access plus conversation. Like every new technology that's coming up, every new thing that's going to be built, it really has to be related to access. So these are all the points that I really think are coming out strongly from the panel. And I will come to you, Rebecca, on this next question. So I think one of the recommendations that has started surfacing from this conversation is around community participation, and you spoke about it strongly from farm to table. So the question that I have for you is, what are some of the challenges and opportunities for community participation in developing AI within Africa? And to what extent can community participation foster more participation of marginalized groups, in particular marginalization along gender, along sexuality, along location, in terms of like urban versus rural?
Sure, thanks. So I think the first thing for me is we need to first change the notion that community participation is just getting to inform people about something and getting them to be giving you information about something. Because most of the time when you talk of community participation, we go to people, we say there's this and that, this is how you participate, this is how you protect your data. We're basically informing them. Or we go to them and we say, we want to build a health system. What do you think should be on it? What can we address? What are your needs that should be part of it? That is not community participation. It's just an act of going to give information and get information. The community participation needs to be deeper than that. Just keep people, it should be, I say, holistic, addressing every need, going from involving everyone from the very beginning all throughout the process, so that it's not something that we just push on them, but it's something that they can actually have ownership of, something that can move beyond the power structures we have and just transfer that power, that the community also have power on what we're pushing towards them. But to move beyond that fact of just what community participation should be like, we also need to look at challenges around trust. That is a very key challenge, and especially when it comes to gender, people look at, let's say, for example, in the voice technology space that we work in, there are people who would ask questions like, you're going to get my voice, what are you going to do with it? There are all these superstitions around voice and all the practices that happen in Africa. There's so many questions that people will bring out, and most of them they fall back to a place that can ensure that we will foster trust. Then community participation is going to be very low. But we also need to just look at digital literacy itself, because when you're talking of AI, it involves having some form of skills and understanding of the digital space. So if we working with communities and we're trying to get them to participate, but we do not impart the skills that they need to be able to understand, removing the technical jargons that are involved in the process and getting people to basically just understand how this thing works in a language that is simple and easy, community participation will be a challenge if we do not put that out of the way. But we also need to look at just the biases that exist in the area itself and try to address them. How do we be more inclusive? If we're talking of community participation, are we involving people with disabilities? Are we involving gender diverse groups? Are we involving people from different backgrounds, educated, uneducated, from rural areas, from urban areas? If we are not involving those different groups that actually exist in our community, then that's not community participation. It's a half work. But we also need to, of course, address the access challenge. We have talked of access a lot because access is really key, especially in our African context. Are people connected? Do people have access to devices? What about cost to access itself, cost to devices? I've been hearing a lot of thoughts going on, especially in DRC, around the fact that copper and cobalt that is used by big tech companies to create telephones and computers is from this place, but the cost of buying the devices is very expensive. And that's what Africa has become, a place where people can get the resources, but then the people themselves cannot afford those access to those devices. So there's looking at all that and how can we push for that. Then there's also a challenge around policy. We do not have enough policies that are pushing for participation. Even in policy process itself, community participation is very low. People are not aware of when the policies are being developed, how they comment, the time itself for people to participate in giving back their feedback on if a policy is fine before it's tabled in the parliament. There's all that challenge as well. But of course, there's still opportunities that definitely exist around the area. If we look at community participation can help us to be more inclusive of having everyone be part of the process. It will help us to be more transparent. It will help AI to be more responsive to the needs of the people, but it also helps in the part of governance itself, because if you're building with a community, then you can be able to address some of those challenges we talked about, like trust. You'll be able to understand, okay, this is the areas where they have challenges and this is what we can do to participate in it. And then that can help us to address those imbalances in power that exist in the community and push for community participation. So for me, I would look at it at the perspective of ensuring that the community participation is holistic, but apart from being holistic, it is helping them to address the needs that they have. It's all about them and not about the solutions we're creating, because the solutions have to respond to what the people need. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That's absolutely spot on in terms of thinking about a holistic approach that is building with the community. Kemi or Rachel, would you also like to add on and respond to this question?
No, I think Rebecca's covered that really thoroughly, and I just find it really, really interesting. So thank you for that.
I mean, it's the same with me. I think she has made the important points around inclusion, and then just going beyond, the superficial information collection and sort of tagging or naming that community, inclusion, and so on. So, yeah, I think those are important points, and I completely agree with. We should have a different approach, a more holistic approach to community involvement.
Thank you both so much. And so, I mean, now to the last question, which is for you, Kimmy. So what are the considerations that need to be taken into account for data protection laws? So specifically thinking about data protection, to have the same reach of protection of African users beyond the continent and be responsive to context. So thinking about how GDPR is kind of like everybody has to be compliant, but I haven't heard like a European country saying that they're going to be like compliant to like POPIA or compliant to ECOWAS. So thinking about how one is valued more than the other. And if there are any current data protection laws that actually do provide sufficient protection against harms from AI-based interventions, especially for marginalized groups. So it's like a two-part question of kind of like, do we have a reach in terms of the current African laws, and are they sufficient to provide protection for harms that we see from AI that particularly impact marginalized groups?
Okay, so I don't know, like you said, the two parts seems slightly complex, but I'm going to try. Yeah. So I think in terms of when we talk about reach of the GDPR, for example, and then Africa just sitting behind, you know, almost being kicked aside, I would say. But I think what you mentioned earlier is really relevant about not having a seat at the table. You know, already laws, policies, even when they have some kind of, you know, or recommendations, if they have some international impact, usually Africa is lagging behind. We are doing other things. And in terms of the GDPR, I think the problem is that in Africa, we don't really have our own, or maybe I should say we have a framework that is not really being enforced. If you look at the Malabo Convention, for example, how long has it been? 2014, and yet it's not coming into force. I would say now, even if it comes into force, it will be a badly outdated framework as far as I'm concerned. So these are all the issues. So if you don't have a voice, you don't have what I would call like a uniform or united front that you are presenting to the world, then it becomes a problem, because the GDPR has an advantage of the bloc. All these countries have the same approach. So you want to do business with all these countries. I mean, what choice do you really have against maybe one isolated African country here and there? So I think the problem is that we don't have that kind of framework. And even in the different laws that you find in Africa, where they sort of say, oh, we'll transfer data if you have adequate protection, I mean, who takes that seriously, really? Because within Africa itself, within the countries, everybody hears or sees the kind of abuse that sometimes goes on. In Nigeria, I would say, for example, the Nigerian Information, or the Identity Management Commission is collecting vast amounts of people's data, the biometric information, and we have the Nigerian Data Protection Regulation, which is supposed to regulate the collection and which has all the provisions and all the rights that the data subjects are supposed to have. And, you know, that's a government institution that is not paying attention to its own regulation and it's not enforcing it. So it would seem quite, I think, hypocritical if you were transferring data outside and then you say, you know, if you are asking for adequate protection like what you have in your own country, you are actually asking for less than what is offered outside. So, you know, as far as that is concerned, I would say it's problematic. And to make it worse, I think Rachel she mentioned that, I think in her paper, where African countries are now resorting to localization of data. No, we'd have it kind of asserting a proprietary right over the data. And we know that issues around data ownership itself is very contested. You know, I don't know if I own my data, much less when it's now with the government and it's now saying, well, we have all this data and it's not going anywhere, it's going to remain here. You can't extract value from data that is stored, that is hoarded. So it's even, I think, counterintuitive, almost illogical to think that you know, those kinds of approaches would even be, you know, adopted at all. But these are the things that we are seeing. So I would say, you know, as far as what kind of protection we have, that is still a big issue that we need to address, you know. And when it comes to communities or, you know, people that are marginalized or, you know, protected attributes like gender, it becomes even more complex. You know, we already have problems with the data protection law, even in the context of AI, with people who understand or who have the elitist view, you know, perhaps you and I who understand some of the issues, and it becomes more complex when you now deal with people who are already underrepresented or who are marginalized. If you look at consent, for example, it's already problematic. I work in this area, I don't read any consent notices unless I'm doing research. I mean, what's the point? You want to read 70 in a day or whatever. So they're talking of consent fatigue. This is with people who know. And when you now talk about, you know, artificial intelligence and collecting more and more data, and you're talking about consent, exactly what are you talking about? There are issues around agency, you know, I think Rebecca mentioned digital literacy. People don't even know, and we say that AI has unforeseen, you know, purposes or unforeseen effects. We can't really say how it will act, what decisions it will make. So exactly what are people going to be consenting to? So, you know, it's more or less reinforcing this idea of a black box. And I'll say something like the right to explanation doesn't help people who have issues around agency in the first place. They can't understand, they already don't know what all this means. And then you say, oh, well, if there's a decision made, like in the GDPR, of course, and you know, a lot of African countries that adopted GDPR-like laws have those provisions where they say, well, you know, you would have a right to explanation. In principle, that is good. But even in practice, within the EU itself, the people who build the technology are pushing back and saying, you know, I read something about counterfactual explanations, which I don't fully understand, but they are saying, yeah, you know, this is the theory and you can do this or that. But in reality, they are saying there are going to be loads of trade-offs if you want this kind of explanation. And it's going to affect those who are already included and much more those who are excluded. So I don't know, I mean, this is an area where we need to look far more into the issues and, you know, consider it in more depth, but certainly the AI has the potential to simply make it more difficult for people to assert their rights under data protection regimes. So, well, I hope that helped somehow.
Absolutely. I remember, thank you so much, Kimmy, for those interventions. And I remember we were speaking to I was doing a research last year, and I was speaking to people asking them, like, do you understand the digital rights? Do you read your consent forms, consent? And they're basically like, if I buy a new phone, I now have to download like 6 of the basic apps. Now I must spend like what, an hour each time reading what they mean, and I don't even understand, and they're not in my language. What exactly, you know, I just want to use the device, and this is the scenario. So we've actually come to the end of this round of panel discussion, which was really great, and so many insightful thoughts came from our panelists. I will actually ask them to give us like concluding remarks, just potentially like a minute each, and then we can wrap up the session. So I will start off with you, Rebecca.
I guess they've been very useful comments that have been thrown about, and I like the discussion around why is it that we don't see the EU complying to some of the policy regulations that are in place within Africa. I think that's something we also need to push. But I guess would say we are adapting a lot of technologies from foreign countries, then we are creating our own. So we need to push for that. If we create our own, then we can be able to push for them to comply within our regulations as well. I'd like to end with that. Thanks.
Thanks, Rebecca. Kemi, any concluding remarks?
Okay, what I would emphasize, I think, which maybe we didn't talk much about, is the inclusion and what we need to do to actually push for inclusion in terms of especially localized or AI that has a lot of local content. How do we ensure that those who are already excluded or who need the solution and much more are actually involved in this process? I think we need to have a roadmap or strategy for doing this. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kemi. Rachel?
Yeah, just thank you to everybody. This has just been so interesting on a number of fronts. Kemi, just now, I think you've raised a really important point about the models of inclusion and exclusion that we are using in the global north to assess biases or potential problems with artificial intelligence do not map so easily onto the different dynamics of very different African societies. We haven't spoken about gender minorities, which is really another issue that plays a particularly critical role in a number of African countries. So thinking about how AI technologies may be used to assess and identify different genders raises a whole new set of issues that I don't think we began to touch on. But safe to say that, you know, it is a very different policy environment in the African region. I think that European policymakers can learn a lot from the African continent in terms of the frameworks for digital inclusion that are being developed in a number of African countries, and the particular types of issues that the African continent is facing and dealing with, in thinking about how to adopt AI in ways that is of public benefit and ultimately we hope of benefit to communities that give their data or may be affected. So yeah, just to thank you all, and Sinead, to thank you very much as well for moderating so fantastically. It's been a really, really interesting and exciting afternoon. So thanks from my side.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for the kind words. It really was a pleasure listening to you all. And also, fun fact, this was a panel that had women only, and we have seen how much the space is dominated by males or by men being seen as experts, or you're only invited to an AI panel if it then says, let's talk about AI and gender. So this for me is actually fantastic work that has been done by APRI in terms of like highlighting the women in these positions talking about these issues. And I would encourage everyone to follow them on their different social media profiles and to read their work and cite them, because it's really important for us to not say there isn't any work that's coming from the continent around these issues when we've got these three fantastic panelists on the platform. And I think just to sum it all up, you know, trust is important, holistic approaches, the question of inclusion, and really being responsive to context instead of us just really like taking policies and then applying them because, well, that's what seems to work. And I think one of the things that actually came up from the points that Kemi raised when I asked her question, you know, like, I think, and also this is raised, like thinking about it from a community perspective. So I do think that these responses will work when we think about that notion of they are beneficial to a particular group of people. And on that note, I'll close our panel and thank you everyone from where you were watching or dialing in, and have a fantastic day.